Hello. Oh, that was lovely, thank you. Thank you for coming out on a rainy night when England are playing in a football match. We're very proud of you, so thank you very much. I'm Tanya Byron, I'm the Chancellor of Edge Hill University, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to this year's Chancellor's Annual Lecture. What's great about being Chancellor at Edge Hill is I get to invite my friends to give really interesting lectures, and there's been many good friends who've come over the years that I've been Chancellor, and this year I'm really happy to have a very good friend here, Giles Fraser, who probably needs no introduction, but I will give you a brief introduction because I think it's important just to recognise his many talents. Giles and I actually knew each other before we were both born. How, you ask? I know, it's extraordinary. I know he's a man of God, but it wasn't because of that. In 1957, my mother, Elfie, who is here tonight, escorting our new mayor, welcome mayor, my mother, Elfie, and Giles's mother, Jill, met at the Leicester Royal Infirmary as two young nurses about to start training, and a friendship was forged which continues to this day. My mum then went on to have myself and my sister Katrina, and Auntie Jilly, as she is called, went on to have Giles and his brother Rupert. So Giles and Rupert, myself and my sister Katrina, grew up as really good friends and have spent many, many, many happy years being friends, and I continue to enjoy the friendship today with both Giles and his brother as they do with myself and my sister. There's many things I could tell you about Giles he wouldn't want you to know because I've known him since he was a child. Well, okay, I will tell you then. The last thing I ever thought Giles would be is a priest, and that's because I grew up with him. But I have to say, what a fine, fantastic man he is, and I think he is the epitome of what it is to be a good Christian, and I will talk about that in a minute. When I was a baby, my mother was very ill, so I had to go and live with Giles and his mum and dad for a while. And so there are two people in this room tonight who have changed my nappy, my mother and the Reverend Giles Fraser. And look how proud he is of that fact.
I remember it well.
Thank you. Don't tweet that, okay? Giles and I have been friends for many years, and when my sister and I were very young, Giles and his brother were at Uppingham School, and we used to be called upon every year to go and be the surrogate sisters to go to the school ball. And I remember as Giles and I got older and rather kind of radically opposed to all that sort of thing, we used to waltz around the Uppingham School large hall, just muttering how ridiculous and bourgeois it was and how we just didn't agree with any of it at all. And a firm friendship was made and continues to this day. Giles is an extraordinary man, and a man who I'm proud to know as a friend and as what I would call a brother. You know he is a priest of the Church of England. He's also 47, I want you to know. He's older than me. He's 2 years older than me. He'll tell you he isn't, but he is. And if you do Wikipedia on both of us, you'll know that I'm right. And he was Canon Chancellor of St Paul's Cathedral from 2009 until he resigned in October of last year. When he was Canon Chancellor of St Paul's, he fulfilled the role of Canon Residentiary and with special responsibility for contemporary ethics and engagement with the City of London as a financial centre, which is hilarious to me and people who know him well because he was always really bad at maths. Currently, he is the parish priest of at St Mary's, Newington in the Elephant and Castle in London. He writes regularly for The Guardian. He is a regular contributor to Thought for the Day on Radio 4, and he's just a really good bloke. He's married to Sally, who is also a friend of mine, and they have 3 lovely children who are all just a real testament to the kind of man that he is. Giles went to Newcastle University and went on to rise up as an academic and eventually became a lecturer in philosophy at Wadham College in Oxford, and is a specialist on the writings of Nietzsche and has authored and co-authored many, many books. He lectures and he continues to lecture on moral leadership for the British Army at the Defence Academy in Shrivenham, and he lectures on ethics and leadership to soldiers, men and women, who will be going to Afghanistan and Iraq. He was also the founder and is currently the president of the Inclusive Church and campaigns passionately and vigorously for lesbian and gay inclusion within the church. And those of you who read his columns in The Guardian would have read a really splendid column on Tuesday where I think he made his feelings about the church's current stance on this issue very well known. And I suppose he's known very well recently in 2011, in October 2011, saying that he was happy for people to exercise their right to protest peacefully outside St Paul's Cathedral, and then resigned as he felt he couldn't sanction any policy of the chapter of St Paul's to use force to remove the protesters. In fact, I can remember the evening that you resigned. We spoke on the phone, and I spoke to you as you were walking around and talking to the protesters. And I remember thinking, what a brave and a moral man you are. You don't just stand and talk about your moral beliefs and the ethics of humanity, but you live them, and you have my greatest respect. I could go on and on about him, and I can tell you some more things about him, slightly more scurrilous later when we've had a couple of glasses of wine together. But you didn't come here to hear about me, so thank you so much for coming, and welcome to Edge Hill. And please, would you welcome my good friend and fantastic, the Reverend Giles Fraser. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. I did actually say that, she said, what shall I say about you when I'm giving my introduction? I said, you can say what you like, but know this. This is your home turf, and it's mutually assured destruction. And luckily, she didn't let too many cats out of the bag. Thank you, very nice to be here. What I'm planning to do this evening is to talk for half an hour or so, and then do much more in terms of Q&A. So we're going to have a more extended Q&A, and when we come to Q&A, I'm happy to talk about anything that you want to talk about and questions that from wherever you come from. So that's absolutely fine. So if you think about things not necessarily related to the lecture, I'm very happy to answer those. Can you hear me at the back? I'm sorry. Is that okay? Good. The title. I do get asked to do speaking engagements quite a lot, and unfortunately, because I'm not terribly organised, in advance, I always give people a terribly bland lecture title, not really knowing what it is that I'm going to talk about, and just having something that will be a sort of hold-all for some future lecture that I might have. And so what we have, this is called, what is it entitled again, this lecture? This is called Moral Leadership in Changing Times. And the story I want to tell you really grows out of my experience since 2004 working with the British Army, as Tanya's explained. In 2004, I was asked by The Guardian to go out to Gaza to do a story about children who, what it is for children to live in a place like Gaza. And as it happened, it was the European Football Championships in 2004. Do you remember it was very unlikely that Greece won it? I think it's probably the last time that Greece ever won anything, poor loves. But that was the year that Greece won it. And I went out, we were kicking a football around with a whole load of the Palestinian kids in Gaza City, and then in the south in Khan Yunis and Rafah. And I mean, it was a quite extraordinary few days. All the only English they knew was Zidane, because he was an Arab, and they kept on saying Zidane, and I would say David Beckham, and that was basically, we'd kick a football around. It was fantastic. And then one afternoon, they said, will you come and see where our houses used to be? So we went with about, I don't know, it was about a dozen kids, 8, 9, 10-year-old kids, down to the southern border of Gaza, which is the border between Egypt and Gaza. And there's a strip there, a militarized strip, called the Philadelphia Strip, which is protected by the Israeli army because that's one of the routes, the major route that arms are smuggled into Gaza. And we walked out, and in order to stop tunnels, the Israelis have knocked down a huge area of what used to be houses. This was where, I think the year before, earlier in 2004, where Tom Herndl was shot, if you remember that, and Rachel Corrie was killed just along there. I didn't realise at the time how dangerous it was, and perhaps it was naive of me to go with them. Anyway, we went out into this big lunar sort of landscape of rubble. And as we were out there, must be 100 yards from the nearest house, the IDF, the Israeli army, opened fire on us. And I saw, I was, this doesn't happen to vicars. At least it happens in the Elephant and Castle probably, but it didn't happen in Putney where I used to be at the time. And I saw, almost cartoon-like, the bullets coming down, pinging up the dirt, going along the road. And they went about that far away from me. And we were with kids, bisected us, the spray of bullets bisected us and the kids that were there. And we ran. And ran to the back of this lady's house who was hanging out her washing. And she just kept on hanging out her washing, even though bullets were flying around. She'd seen it loads of times before. And I stood behind the brick wall, my heart just pumping. And I've never quite been the same again after that experience. Came home, reflecting on nearly being killed, reflecting on running away, reflecting on was that the right thing to do. Kids ran in all directions. Nobody was hurt. And I started thinking a little bit about what it is to work every day in a place that's that dangerous, to what it is to be a soldier in the British Army. And I did a thought for the day on this, and for some extraordinary reason, I got a phone call. The British Army is a most extraordinary institution. I got a phone call because this chap heard me on the radio saying, hello, would you like to come and talk at the Defence Academy in Shrivenham about your experiences and about leadership and the battlefield? Well, I have absolutely no idea about this, but being rather foolish, I said I'd love to. And there was first time I went there was a lecture theatre for about double the size of this, with 400 people, all in uniform, all sitting bolt upright, and he's standing there giving a lecture on morality, leadership, and the battlefield. And I've now done that 4 or 5 times a year since late 2004. And I've learnt so much about courage, about leadership, and about ethics from my engagement with those officers. They're majors, so they're about to take up command responsibility. And they are the most extraordinary people. My dad was in the Air Force, and I was slightly put off the military life. I had a military sort of upbringing, and I wasn't too interested in all things military until I started in this engagement. And I'm a bit of a lefty, so I was against the war in Iraq quite emphatically, and I'm against the war in Afghanistan, though less emphatically. But that wasn't what I was talking about. I was talking with them about what courage means, what doing the right thing on the battlefield means. When you have life and death decisions, when you have a gun and you have a child in your sights, a person who may be, or somebody who is talking into a walkie-talkie or into a mobile phone, dickers they're called, and they may be going on the mobile phone, I'll be 20 minutes late for tea, Mum, or they may be going on the mobile phone, Malta goes 2 degrees right. Do you shoot or do you not shoot? They may be holding something that's about to blow up your mates. Do you shoot or do you not shoot? And I taught ethics at the University of Oxford for a while, and I had to tell you it is much more interesting and more challenging teaching British Army officers because they really concentrate. And they concentrate because it is absolutely crucial to them that there is a sort of moral space in which they can operate. Because they know if there's not a moral space in which they can operate, and they're very, very emphatically keen on it, then the job that they do is incredibly problematic. So I haven't ever taught such an attentive audience. But, and here's the stuff that it widens it to all of us, but there is a problem that they have, and it's a problem that sort of began in the late 20th century. And that is that all the stuff we thought we agreed upon about morality seemed in society at large to be breaking down. And the army reflects the morality of the society that it serves. Since the 17th century, and if you look at the sort of founding documents of the British Army, and a lot of, I mean, I could have bore you rigid reading out lots of stuff, but Christianity formed the sort of core moral sort of principles. I think probably it became sort of public school Christianity for the officer class became at its heart. And even up till, quite astonishingly, the late 70s, in the late 70s, it still has in Queen's regulations that it's the job of the British Army officer to convert their men to Christianity. In the late 70s. Secularisation got the British Army very late. But when secularisation got the British Army, the question then comes, and this is why it's a question for the rest of us, where do our morals come from? Now, if you don't have to ask yourselves questions about shooting children, then perhaps you don't need to bother too much with that. But if you do, and you need to have a robust moral framework, the question is, where does that come from? And they asked this question of themselves in the back end of the 20th century with a real moral seriousness. The other problem they had, and it's not unrelated, is that, generally speaking, we became a much more diverse society. The army's probably not as diverse as the society it serves. Nonetheless, it is diverse. And one way of describing how we've changed as a society might be that we've gone from being a thick society to a thin society. And what I mean by that is, if you think of a thick society being, let me just paint in really broad colours. You might say a thick society is a small Welsh village. Everybody knows everybody else. Everybody looks like everybody else. You keep your back door open. You all share the same values. So there's a high degree of social solidarity, but a low degree of diversity. Now, in that context, everybody thinks roughly the same thing in terms of morality. I'm painting in broad colours. And then you go to the thin society, perhaps where I am in the Elephant and Castle. Now, the thin society is a very, very diverse society. People come from all different parts of the world. They come from all different backgrounds. That diversity is absolutely rich, but there isn't the same sort of sense of agreement, same sort of solidarity. And so, even though it's very difficult to be, in the thick society, it's difficult to be different. It's probably difficult growing up to be gay or something like that in the small Welsh village where everybody shares the same values. It's a completely different matter in the thin society. We now value diversity, but there isn't so much solidarity. There isn't so much sense of a shared idea. Now, the problem is that the community that understands itself, understands its own values, that you know what you're for. The diverse society is slightly more anxious about where its morals come from. And the army is exactly the same. So you get this thing in about the turn of the century where the army starts to go, so where do our morals come from? And they produce, and it happens, strangely, it happens in America exactly the same time. And what they do is they start rethinking, a fascinating exercise, they start rethinking morality right from the ground up. They produce two documents. The Americans produce, boringly, Field Manual 2200, which is absolutely brilliant piece of philosophical rhetoric, absolutely brilliant. And the British produce Values and Standards of the British Army. I think it comes out in about 2001, I think that came out. And I'm going to try and just paint what they did and what their thought structure was in getting to these two documents. So, no longer are we going to rely on Christianity for our ethics. Where do our ethics come from? There are two options traditionally, two broadly speaking areas of ethical knowledge, of ways of doing things that they looked at. One is, and I'll do this very, very quickly, is utilitarianism. And I'm sure people have heard of John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham. They self-consciously were trying to invent a post-God ethic. And good for them meant something that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. It's a form of ethics that's called consequentialist, because something is good if its consequences are good. Now, that works, roughly speaking, you could say, in a number of cases, but I want to take you into the mind of a soldier fighting on the battlefield. How confusing, how fast-moving it is. The decisions that you have to make are instant decisions. How do you know what the consequences of what you're about to do are? You know that stuff you get about the butterfly flaps its wings in and there's an earthquake in somewhere else, people, those sorts of things. What are the consequences of? And there's a number of different scenarios that moral philosophers have painted where actually the greatest happiness of the greatest number may be served by doing something that feels quite wrong. So, for example, Tanya has committed is up for committing some terrible crime. She's in a courtroom. She's apparently killed a child. Now, I'm the judge. I know she's innocent of this because I know she's innocent. But you, outside, you think she's guilty. And if I let her off, even though I know she's innocent, you're going to riot. You're going to destroy Ormskirk, because you just are. You're just really. Actually, you might even kill people. You're so annoyed. The greatest happiness for the greatest number in that situation would be me sending her to prison, and you going home quietly. Now, that's one of those silly philosophical sort of things that people often use, but the army were very clear that you can't have a consequentialist ethic for the battlefield, that it's all about what the consequences are. It has to be something clearer, more direct. The obvious one is rule-based ethics, deontological ethics it's called. The classic rule-based ethic is thou shalt not, the Ten Commandments. Let's have a book of rules about what a soldier can and can't do on the battlefield, much clearer. You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do that, you can't do that. Nothing about the consequences, it's just you can't do these things. Rule-based ethics. Now that is actually what people think ethics sort of looks like. That ethics has to look like a sort of thou shalt not, this is wrong, don't do that. And so what you have, and especially in the era of human rights, when all of that gets legalized, you have poor soldiers. If you've seen the amount of legislation under which they now operate, it is quite astonishing. I do a double act with some of the military lawyers sometimes, and I once said to one of the military lawyers, rather cheekily, I said, do you even know all the rules that are in that book? And his response was, no, I have a life. Now, if you think about it, what we've done, I believe, is we've tried to subcontract morality to the lawyers and got the lawyers to produce vast, I mean, in a way, huge amounts of law that applies to the battlefield. And then we ask our young men and women to make instant moral decisions on the basis of a huge amount of rules, most of which they can't remember. They try and boil them down to, there's card alphas, little things that you can try, but basically, huge amount of legislation that applies. We think that there are 10 commandments. Anybody tell me how many commandments there really are in the Hebrew Scriptures? 614, exactly right. It's 614. And you go from 10 to 614, because what happens is, you go, here's 10, and then some smart aleck will go, yeah, but they don't cover this scenario, or we need another one. Then you have another one. And the more confusing the scenario, the more rules you need. The model battlefield is one of the most confusing places and difficult places you can imagine. So the legislation that applies to it is voluminous. And so we freight our soldiers with a huge amount of legislation, and it's actually incredibly difficult. The other problem with thou shalt not as a way of thinking about ethics, I think this is a real problem psychologically, is it makes it sound like, and this is what it feels like, and no one will say it quite, it makes it feel like you're sort of sending soldiers into battle with their hands behind their back. You're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do that, you're not allowed to do that. And they're going, bloody hell, there's a lot of stuff we're not allowed to do. It's like they can do all this stuff, but and it's almost like we're telling them that when you go and do morality, it's like, this is just another obstacle that we're putting in their way to do the job they need to do, if it's seen as thou shalt not. So is there a way of thinking about morality that isn't about huge amounts of rules, that isn't about any sort of consequentialism, that doesn't make you feel that the person who's, as it were, talking to you about ethics is really making your job 1,000 times more difficult? Well, I actually think there is. And and I think it's something that the army has been terribly good at. And what they came up with, the army, and I think rightly so, both the Americans and the Brits, is they went back to Aristotle and to what's called virtue ethics, which was sort of repopularized in the mid-part of the 20th century with first through a paper by a rather brilliant thinker called Elizabeth Anscombe. And what virtue ethics does is a completely different sort of way of thinking about ethics. The right and wrong, it's not about what you do, here's the crucial bit, it's about who you are. It's about who you are. What sort of person are you? So the idea is that if you're the sort of person that sort of inculcates virtuous behaviour, if you are, as it were, whatever this means, we'll come to this in a minute, a good person, then a good person will approximate to the right decision when they're put in a situation where they have to make a decision like that. You don't have to look it up. You don't have to sit there about what's the consequences, what's going to happen. I would want the person to be the good person who inculcates all sorts of virtues, and that person, even without the rules, and get this wrong, they'll get it wrong sometimes and won't, but that's the nature of a confusing battlefield. But that's the person who will approximate to the right decision, the person who is good. It grows out of, in this Field Manual 22-100, the Americans, it has this rather, there's nothing to write on here, it has this thing that says, be, know, do. And that actually, at its core, the moral life is who you are. That's actually really the sort of banner of this lecture. It's about who you are that is morality, not about what you do. That's what issues from who you are. And the army have been really, really good about, traditionally been really, really good about knowing that it's what we in the church call formation. It's about making someone into, as it were, a moral person. How do you do that? Well, one of the things you do that through is training. The reason you strip a Bren gun 500 times when you're on the parade ground is so you can also strip it when you're being shot at, when you're being fired at, when you're really confused, when you're tired, when you've been up all night and you're terrified. You practice it and you practice it and practice it until it becomes second nature. The same is true of the moral life. That actually it's a form of practice, that it shapes you. And so actually when you have to make instant moral decisions, you're actually acting out of something about who you are. It's absolutely crucial, who you are and who you think you are. There's a brilliant little book, again by an American ethical writer, called Mark Osriel, called Obeying Orders. And he has a superb passage in it where he talks about, in Vietnam, a young private, I guess, who has completely seen red. And some of his mates have been killed. And he's got some prisoners there, and he's about to just, he really is about to do something incredibly nasty to these prisoners. And the commanding officer comes in, assesses the situation right, and has, he believes, one shot, one chance to stop him doing it. And he really has completely seen red. He's got to use his words right. He does not say, subsection 4, paragraph 2 says this is wrong of the rule book. You don't say that because, like, I don't care. You say 4 words he did it with. Marines don't do that. They were the words that stopped him. Marines don't do that. And why that phrase worked is the word Marines had come to mean something, had come to be freighted with all sorts of values that came through the pictures on the wall in the mess and the stories that people told each other and the values that you shared as a community. And the word Marines, or whatever your regiment is or whatever your group is, had come to be impregnated with a sense of sort of moral seriousness, who you were, very close to about being who you are. That he goes, yeah, absolutely get it. That something about doing the right thing is about who you've become. And we have this idea of, we have a too reflective idea of morality. That you sit there and you think, here's the problem. Right, how am I going to work this out? And what you see on the battlefield, that can't be done. There's no time to do that. It has to be about who you are. And that seems to me to be a very brilliant observation about what morality is about. Philosophically, we have this problem that we're terribly individualist. And that everything, as it were, begins inside us. And then the authentic life is the one that you simply, what did Polonius say in Hamlet? To thine own self be true. That's the sort of basis of what it is to be moral. So you find out, the idea of being moral is to find out what it is you really believe inside, or something like that. I'm quite scornful of that individualism that we now have. And I think part of the problem we have in thinking about ethics, not just on the battlefield, but more broadly, is that we begin with this model. Whereas actually, what you do shapes who you are as much as who you are shapes what you do. There's a continual sort of relationship between these two things. Alcoholics Anonymous have this brilliant phrase. I absolutely love this. I think it's probably the clearest and best form of moral wisdom there is, and it's from Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's for people who want to be something different than they are. Fake it till you make it. Fake it till you make it. The idea is not that you somehow find some inner strength to do this sort of thing. Act in a certain way, behave in a certain way, and you will end up being transformed into the person that you are behaving to be. Walk in those shoes, and you'll end up being more like that person. Fake it till you make it. Now, that's absolutely true. The army gets that. So, I don't think I'm a good person. I don't want to do all this stuff. That's all an excuse. Not interested in all that. Thank you, very good. Not interested in you being some deep, reflective moral thinker. Just get on and do it. Fake it till you make it, even if you don't think it's you. Just be part of that process in which you're formed. And that process in which you're formed issues in a completely different form of moral wisdom. It's very counterintuitive in an age where we are... Is that the time already? Okay, I'm going to finish with one story about this, and then we'll go on to it, because we can do tons of stuff. We'll do tons of stuff in Q&A. One of my great heroes is a theologian called Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was hung by the Nazis for his, in Flossenburg concentration camp, for his plot to kill Hitler, and amongst other things. And, no, not amongst other things, that. That would do it, wouldn't it? And he has this, he's just a very, he was a very sort of together, dignified German. And he's constantly, and he's very admired by the other people who are in the concentration camp. And he, walks out of his cell with a certain sort of dignity and head up held. And he's giving this impression to everybody of not being scared. And he said, inside, I'm absolutely bloody terrified. And he writes this poem, which is Who Am I? And it says, which is the real me? Is the real me the one that's terrified inside, that, is absolutely, I don't know if I can do this, or is the real me the one that walks out of my cell, head held high, confident, brave? And actually, in our culture, with its commitment to sort of authenticity, we believe that the frightened person is the real him. And he begins to question that. Maybe the real him is the brave person, and that the frightened inside person is the sort of, just the consequence, the trail that his bravery has left behind, the fear but nonetheless, the real person is the person who behaves in a certain sort of way. And what I take from that, and I think that's right, is that part of what I think we need to discover as a culture, and I think we can learn from the army about leadership, about morality, about ethics, is it's not just about discussion programs on the radio or the telly. It's not just about some sort of deep thinking and finding yourself. But actually it's about sharing a form of behaviour and adopting a form of behaviour. And I grant you, there's loads of questions that I haven't even looked at here about what sort of behaviour that is, that actually shapes who you are, that it's about being a part of a moral community. And that's what you get in the army. It's why I'm very, very, very against the way in which governments mess around with regiments. Regiments are the basis of moral community that actually structure what it is to be, what right and wrong means in those contexts. And it's not an individual thing. And the idea that we subcontract all of that to the lawyers, even to human rights lawyers, is, I think, one of the ways in which we get very confused in our society about what it is to be a good person and to be in leadership. Fake it till you make it. Thank you.